Paris, December 10th, 1948, 3 o'clock in the morning. The hall has been awake for almost 20 hours. The delegates of 58 nations have just cast their votes on a single sheet of paper, a document that for the first time in human history defines what every man, woman, and child on Earth is entitled to. As the result is read out, the entire General Assembly rises to its feet, not for the document, for one woman. Now let us hear Eleanor Roosevelt herself, speaking about human rights a few years later on Human Rights Day.
The object is to make people everywhere conscious of the importance of human rights and freedoms.
The belief that every person should be able to walk the earth with dignity did not begin in this famous moment. It was shaped much earlier, in a childhood marked by loss, loneliness, and the search for a place to belong. This is where the story of Eleanor Roosevelt begins. New York City, October 11, 1884. Into one of America's most prominent families, a girl is born. A girl who will spend her entire life struggling against her own shyness. Anna Eleanor Roosevelt is the niece of Theodore Roosevelt, the future 26th President of the United States. And yet her childhood begins under the worst possible signs. Her mother, Anna Hall, a celebrated beauty of New York society, makes her own daughter feel her distance, and mockingly calls her Granny because the child seems so old-fashioned and serious from the age of 8. At that very age, Eleanor loses her mother. A year later, she loses her beloved but severely alcoholic father, Elliott Roosevelt. The girl now grows up with her stern grandmother Hall in Tivoli in the Hudson Valley, alone, fearful, in a dark world of duties and prohibitions. It is the years at Allenswood Boarding Academy near London between 1899 and 1902 that finally open another world to her. The free-spirited headmistress, Marie Silvestre, recognizes the potential in this insecure young American and makes her a favorite pupil. Languages, history, social responsibility. Eleanor discovers she can think, argue, lead. At 18, she returns to New York, a different woman. On March 17, 1905, Eleanor marries her fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in New York. The bride is given away by Theodore Roosevelt himself, the sitting president of the United States. It is the wedding of the season and the beginning of one of the most complex marriages in American history. Eleanor bears 6 children between 1906 and 1916. One dies in infancy. While Franklin rises politically, first as a senator from New York State, then from 1913 as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Eleanor loses herself in the role of wife and mother, dominated by her controlling mother-in-law, Sarah Roosevelt. In the autumn of 1918, a discovery shatters everything. Unpacking her husband's travel bag, Eleanor finds love letters addressed to her own social secretary, Lucy Mercer. She offers Franklin a divorce. For political and financial reasons, the marriage continues. But from that day on, it becomes something else entirely. No longer a romantic partnership, but a partnership of equals. 3 years later, in the summer of 1921, Franklin contracts polio at the family island of Campobello. He will never again walk unaided. And it is Eleanor who pulls him back into public life, speaking, traveling, fighting on his behalf. She joins the Women's Trade Union League, the League of Women Voters, the Democratic Party of New York. The shy, widowed daughter has become a political force. On March 4, 1933, Eleanor Roosevelt enters the White House as First Lady. What she makes of this ceremonial position has never been seen before. Just 2 days after Franklin's inauguration, she holds her own press conference, the first by any First Lady in American history. Only female journalists are permitted to attend. With this single move, she forces America's major newspapers to hire women reporters if they want continued access to the White House. On December 30, 1935, The first installment of her daily newspaper column, My Day, appears. She will continue it for 27 years, 6 days a week, almost until her last breath. A mirror of her public and private life, read by millions. While her husband learns about the realities of the Great Depression, mostly through reports, Eleanor descends into the coal mines of West Virginia, visits slums, Indian reservations, soup kitchens. The newspapers mock her as the ever-traveling First Lady. But she becomes Franklin's eyes and ears in a suffering nation. When she returns to the White House at night, she writes down what she has seen and reads it to the president at his bedside. Her causes: women's rights, workers' rights, support for young people. She fights for federal anti-lynching legislation and finds herself in open conflict with the southern wing of her own party. February 1939. The African-American contralto Marian Anderson, one of the greatest voices of her time, is scheduled to perform at Constitution Hall in Washington. But the owners of the venue, the ultra-conservative Daughters of the American Revolution, deny her the stage on racial grounds. Eleanor Roosevelt herself has been a member of that organization since 1933. On February 26, 1939, she writes her resignation letter. The next day, she explains publicly in My Day, to remain in an organization whose actions one rejects is to consent to them. Behind the scenes, Eleanor coordinates a counterstroke with Interior Secretary Harold Ickes and the NAACP that will write itself into American history. On Easter Sunday, April 9, 1939, Marian Anderson sings on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial before 75,000 people, black and white, side by side, in a still segregated Capitol. Millions more listen on NBC radio. It is one of the earliest pivotal moments of the American Civil Rights Movement. Eleanor herself stays away from the event, so as not to take the moment from Anderson. With America's entry into the Second World War, Eleanor takes on the role of Assistant Director of the Office of Civilian Defense in 1941. But her most important front lies across the Pacific. In August and September 1943, she boards an unarmed Navy transport plane bound for the South Pacific. For 5 weeks, she visits hospitals on Guadalcanal, Bora Bora, New Zealand, Australia, and 17 other bases. She speaks with wounded soldiers, takes down letters to be carried home to their mothers. Admiral William Halsey, who had initially scoffed at her visit, will later write that she did more for troop morale in 5 weeks than any other public figure. April 12, 1945. Franklin D. Roosevelt dies in Warm Springs, Georgia, of a cerebral hemorrhage. Eleanor receives the news by telephone in the White House. When a reporter asks what she will do now, she answers, "The story is over." She is wrong. In December 1945, President Harry Truman calls the widow of his predecessor. He wants Eleanor Roosevelt to serve as a U.S. delegate to the newly founded United Nations. She hesitates. She has neither diplomatic experience nor legal training. But by the end of that same evening, she agrees. Her male colleagues initially try to push her onto the most insignificant of all committees, the Social and Humanitarian Committee. A mistake. In the spring of 1946, she is elected chair of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. Her task? To create a document that will translate the lessons of Auschwitz, Hiroshima, and the bombing war into law. Over 2 years, through hundreds of sessions, she navigates the front lines of the emerging Cold War. The Soviets insist on economic and social rights, the Americans on civil and political ones. Eleanor forces both sides into synthesis. At her side, the Lebanese philosopher Charles Malik, the Chinese diplomat P.C. Chang, the French jurist René Cassin, the Canadian director John Humphrey, and the only other woman in the commission, the Indian Hansa Mehta, to whom the world owes the formulation all human beings instead of the original all men. On September 28, 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt delivers her most famous speech at the Sorbonne in Paris, The Struggle for Human Rights. She warns against allowing the great words of freedom to be co-opted by dictatorships. Then, in the night of December 9th to 10, 1948, in the Palais de Chaillot in Paris, the moment arrives. At around 3 in the morning, The United Nations General Assembly votes on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 48 votes in favor, none against, 8 abstentions. The Soviet bloc, Saudi Arabia, and South Africa among them. As the result is announced, the delegates rise to their feet in a standing ovation for the only woman at the chair. Eleanor Roosevelt herself will later call the document an international Magna Carta for all mankind. In 1953, the new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, forces her out of the UN delegation. But Eleanor keeps traveling to India, to Japan, to the Soviet Union. She meets Nikita Khrushchev at the Black Sea resort of Yalta, preaches human rights in Moscow, writes books, lectures at American universities. In 1961, John F. Kennedy brings the 76-year-old back into politics. She becomes chair of the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, the commission that will pave the way for the women's movement of the coming decades. On November 7, 1962, Eleanor Roosevelt dies in her New York City apartment of complications from aplastic anemia and reactivated bone marrow tuberculosis. She is buried beside Franklin in the Rose Garden of her beloved Hyde Park. 3 sitting and former presidents attend the funeral: Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy. The conventions of her generation had decreed that the widow of a great man should fall silent. Eleanor Roosevelt chose otherwise. She turned a life lived in shadow into a life lived for others, and turned a shy orphan into the woman whom the diplomat Adlai Stevenson, on the day of her burial, eulogized with the words, "She would rather light a candle than curse the darkness, and her glow has warmed the world."